Earlier today, we found out De'Aaron Fox has a broken finger, and then just got news that Kawhi Leonard is expected to be out for Game 5, making what's already been an injury-riddled playoffs even more influenced by the absence of these stars. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and my goal in this channel is to help teach you about the medical side of the sports world. In a season full of stories about load management and an attempt to prevent players from getting hurt, here we are at the most important time of the year dealing with star after star suffering another injury that's going to have an undoubtable effect on the outcomes of these playoffs. Some of them have been completely random and bad luck. Here with De'Aaron Fox as he goes up to try and finish this play, tossing up a layup after the play's already been blown dead, we find out he ended up with a fractured finger on his left side. Here as he goes up, what likely happened is just swiping down from the Warriors player, probably hit directly on his pointer finger, and now we find out that Fox is dealing with a fracture, and specifically his distal phalanx. After the play, we could see him grabbing at that finger a little bit, didn't really think much of it, and he's going to try to play in the next game, but is probably going to be hampered somewhat, dealing with either pain or impaired function in that finger. On our biodigital anatomy tool here, these are the bones of the hand. And when we go through our index finger, our middle finger, our ring finger, and our pinky finger, we have three phalanges. We have a proximal phalanx, which is closest to the rest of the body. We have a middle phalanx, and then a distal phalanx, the one that's furthest out towards the fingernail. The one that Fox fractured is this distal phalanx. It's basically the bone of your finger that's right below your fingertip. Depending on where the fracture is, if it's a crush fracture right here at the tip, we call it a Tufts fracture. We have to worry about damage to the nail bed and providing some complications later on. It can also be at the shaft or here at the base. With Fox, it sounds like he's going to try and give it a go, but you can imagine if you're dealing with pain in your index finger as you're rolling off from your shot, that's definitely going to have some effect on your offensive production. The Kawhi Leonard injury has no more clarity than what we should expect based on his history of these sort of unknown, unusual types of injury patterns. The only thing that's been going around the internet is a potential injury time was here right at the end of Game 1. When he was coming down, he stepped a little bit awkwardly on that right knee here as he was falling outwards to his side. And of course now is dealing with this nondescript right knee sprain that's going to have him out of Game 5. Frankly, it's hard to say if this was for sure the moment where this injury could have occurred because Kawhi ended up playing in all of Game 2, and who knows how bad things were at this point versus what might have been exacerbated in Game 2. But I don't see any unusual shift here. I don't see any inward movement or shift of his tibia to make me think there's been a new injury to his ACL. But of course, it's really hard with Kawhi because this is similar to what happened when he did tear the ACL. It started off as this nondescript knee sprain, which implies an injury to a ligament, and then we found out ultimately it was his ACL, and he missed the whole and subsequent season. We got a recent report from Chris Haynes, though, that's really concerning and makes me worried about Kawhi's status for honestly the rest of the first round, if not even the second round. Haynes said that Kawhi was dealing with a significant amount of swelling inside the knee that started after Game 2, and there was no timetable for his return. If the report is true about swelling inside Kawhi's knee, that raises concern for either an intra-articular ligament injury like the ACL or the PCL, or what's probably more common, an injury to something like the meniscus, or just honestly irritation of the cartilage within Kawhi's knee. Injuries to things like the LCL, like we'll talk about with Joel Embiid, or the MCL, which is an injury like Kevin Durant suffered earlier in the year, those injuries don't typically cause swelling inside the knee joint. They might cause some pain and swelling outside of the joint, but those are extra-articular, meaning outside of the joint structures. So if the reporting is true here about a real effusion or swelling inside the knee, then that makes something like an MCL sprain or an LCL injury much less likely. To me, the most probable thing is that this is either irritation of the meniscus in Kawhi's knee or the cartilage in Kawhi's knee, because both of those are injuries that can initially be a little bit nondescript and hard to pick up. But the more you load, the more you play on them, the more you irritate them, and the more you develop that fluid and swelling inside the knee joint. These are also injuries that are much harder to definitively treat in a short time span like what we have here in the playoffs. It really is a balance of how much you're loading the joint versus how much rest you're putting the joint through before you're able to functionally recover and play well. And in a player like Kawhi, we've seen this history before of a real sort of challenge between managing the load through the structure and the subsequent pain and symptoms through those same structures. It might not matter if the Clippers lose Game 5, but even if they win, I'd honestly be surprised if we saw Kawhi the rest of the first round, and even if this didn't cause him to miss some time in subsequent rounds, if they do advance. My pessimism for Kawhi explains why I'm more optimistic, though, on a different player, Joel Embiid, who we found out recently some more details. It seems to be an injury to his LCL, a sprain of the lateral collateral ligament that happened here on this play. As Joel was coming up and going down, my honest first thought was just something like a little bit of a bone contusion or a bone bruise, because it looked like he hyperextended his right knee just a little bit as he landed here on the ground. But if we look at the position of his foot down here, he's a little bit on the outside of his foot, and so I suspect from a different angle, his knee is probably being bent a little bit outward. As the knee bends outward, that's going to stretch the structures on the outside of the knee, particularly the LCL. And if we play through the rest of this, we could even see Joel grabbing down there on the outside of his knee as he came up from this play. In this other angle, we can again see that little bit of a jar in that right knee as he lands. And so it's probably just the most subtle amount of strain that caused some injury to that LCL. Now, it's probable that there's some bone bruising still underneath all this, but the LCL is a more identifiable injury that they can describe and sort of report as what he's recovering from. But going back to our anatomy model here, I'm more optimistic about that because it's a true, discrete injury. The swelling is going to be outside the joint. It's something with a much more reliable timetable that you can also provide some external support to brace and get somebody back through. This isn't something that's going to be subjectively loaded repeatedly, causing more irritation and fluid buildup like something that's inside the joint. So while Embiid might have a longer absence and be out for early on in the second round, it's something that once it recovers, in my mind, should be done and behind him, unlike something potentially inside the joint with Kawhi, that it's going to be more of a load management in terms of how it responds throughout the rest of the playoffs, on and off sort of injury. But this is another one of those total fluke types of injuries. If he doesn't land right here this exact way, if Johnson isn't in this exact position, Embiid doesn't slightly hyperextend, he doesn't load his LCL, and he's not injured. Moving on to other stars, of course, we've talked about two big falls. Giannis, of course, has come back and has been able to play and look pretty effective, but some fluke fall landing on just the right spot that causes enough of a bruise kept Giannis out enough that hopefully the Bucks can recover and still win the series, but again, has really opened things up in the East from when the Heat were able to come back and do well early on. The other major fall, of course, here was with Morant. As he goes up, he comes down and lands in just the right awkward position on his right wrist that he forces it into that hyper-flexed position, and another player that while he's been able to return is undoubtedly going to be hampered by this throughout the remainder of the playoffs. There's just no way that you can sustain this degree of force through your wrist and not at least have it affect you to some degree when you're playing at this level at the end of the season. If Davis is not exactly in this position, because you can see here as Ja's trying to fall, he's trying to bring that right arm back and be able to plant more firmly with his hand outstretched like we see with his left hand, but because his right arm runs into Anthony Davis's thigh, that pushes it forward, that gets his fingers locked into this goofy position and forces him into that hyperflexion. So again, yes, Ja plays this way. It's a riskier way to play, but the perfect position for Davis to be in as he comes down, forces his wrist into that angle, and leads to this injury. And finally, how many times have we seen players dive for loose balls throughout the season and not suffer any injury at all? But then sure enough, on this play, Tyler Herro ends up breaking 2 bones in his hand. I honestly don't know if there's another sport that's as influenced and altered in the postseason by injuries to its stars. We saw this happen when Kawhi stepped on Zaza's foot recently. Of course, we saw it when Kawhi tore his ACL in the playoffs. There's so much hanging on individual players in the NBA playoffs that an injury truly can change the entire landscape of the season in terms of who comes out the champion. And we joke about the best ability is availability, and honestly, to a big degree, that's true. We're seeing it played out right now in the playoffs. It forces you to almost consider more who was the healthiest team, not just who was the best team, whenever we see things like this happening throughout the playoffs, and it's only the first round, which is crazy to think that this could potentially continue to happen, and we might see more of these injuries to big stars in the rest of the playoffs. I'm not smart enough to make some big point through all this with things like load management. Enough of these injuries were fluky things like Herro diving for the ball or Fox getting his finger broken that you clearly cannot blame the season schedule, the workload, etc. As opposed to other things on one hand like Kawhi's, maybe you could, but again, we still really don't know. But overall, I just hope this was educational, especially to talk about Kawhi, talk a little bit about Embiid and De'Aaron Fox, and really just this landscape with the playoffs. It's a huge bummer because it really is influencing things, and I think takes away from who truly is the best team out there and makes it more about who is the healthiest, or in some cases, just honestly, the luckiest team on the court. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later.